The Arrowverse has had 20 seasons now, and each one of these seasons has a main villain. I've made a lot of videos going, like, ranking all the main villains in a lot of different ways, like, just which one is my favorite to my least favorite, or I mean the other way around, or the least to most powerful. This time around, I'm ranking them from just their costumes, just the way they look aesthetically, like, the cooler they look, the higher they'll be on the list, and the lower they look, the lower they'll be on the list. Also, the more comic accurate they look, the higher they'll be on the list as well. There are some exceptions to that, but I do love a comic book accurate costume, so whatever thoughts I have about the character outside of how cool they look aesthetically will not be at all considered for this video. So let's start this video with number 17, because I'm not including three main villains: Mullis, because he doesn't have a costume, Neuron, because he also doesn't have a costume, and the Legion of Doom, because not only are they characters who are also going to be on this list, all three of them, but also they don't bring any new costumes that the other ones don't already have, so this will only be 17 instead of the 20 that the other ones are usually. So let's start the video.
Minutes. I agree. You want to shoot me? Do it! Right here!
So Diaz doesn't really have much of a costume. It's really just a regular black suit and a black button-down shirt. That's really mostly what he wears, which is fine because he doesn't really have a costume in the comics. Typically in the comics, he's not wearing a shirt, and that's his costume, that's his look. So I have no problem with this. It's just that it's not really anything interesting at all, so it's at the bottom of the list because it's really boring. It's just a suit and nothing else.
What are you? Miss Fayyad, many members of Hive, they consider me to be a charlatan.
Similarly to Diaz, Dark literally just wears a suit and also a black button-down shirt, but he also wears a tie. The reason he's higher than Diaz is really just because the suit is a nicer suit, and that is it. It's still a very boring costume for a main villain. It's still aesthetically not very interesting in the show, but it is a nicer suit than Diaz, so it is one slot higher.
Perhaps they're smarter than you gave them credit.
Perhaps. But I'm smarter.
I don't have any problem with the Thinker's costume. I think it definitely worked for the show, and he was a lot more interesting as a character when he was wearing this costume, or at least when he was being played by Neil Sandilands. Anyway, I think his hat thingy actually looks really good, like the way they put it on his head. It looks pretty cool. The rest of his costume is really just a blue jumpsuit, or maybe it's black. He's only really ever wearing it in his blue room, and it always has like a shade of blue, so I don't really know if it's black or blue. Either way, it's definitely not a cool costume per se, but it's definitely a costume that works for the show. Still though, it's near the bottom of the list because it's just not that cool.
What do you know? It works. You are a champion of this world. I have my moments. You have had your last. Stop! Stay.
Nonce's costume is very middle of the road for me. It feels kind of lazily designed, as well as just the fabric that it is made out of looks pretty weird on screen. I don't dislike the design at all, and I think that it can look cool at times, but it definitely is. It doesn't deserve to be any higher than where it is at on the list, which is number 14.
Your people, kryptonite poisoned my entire world. I've carried it across galaxies. It's part of me now. So go ahead. Make me bleed.
Rhea's costume is really just a blue dress, but also the Daxamite thingy or whatever that is that she adds on there. That part of it is the only part of it that definitely makes it a little bit more interesting, because for the most part it's definitely a pretty boring costume. Still though, it is a little better than Nonce and everybody else that she is higher than on the list.
Come to join the party? You should have left me back in 2166. Yeah, we know that, Mullenhead. Who are you to stand up against me? Vandal Savage, destroyer of empires.
Vandal Savage wears this blue trench coat as well as this red leather thing under it. I actually kind of like this, and I'm going to be pretty positive in this video, because although not all the main villains are very good at all, most of them, in fact, as we've seen, are not, but the costumes are typically actually pretty great, which is why Vandal Savage, who is only 14 out of 17 in this list, is actually a costume that I don't mind at all. The comic book version of Vandal Savage never wears a costume, and it would look stupid if he did. It wouldn't fit the character at all, which is why I'm glad that I actually appreciate this design. I think it looks pretty cool. Still though, it is not anywhere higher on the list because the other costumes I think are a little bit better. Merlin's costume, I think, does definitely look pretty cool. The only problem with the costume is that it feels like a little cheap compared to a lot of the other costumes in this list and in the Arrowverse in general, which makes sense because of the fact that it was from the first season of Arrow and they didn't really get a grasp of what the costumes should look like, or they were trying to have a more realistic thing, which I think because of that, it really works for the character and for the season and the contrast between Merlin and Oliver, and I think it also looks pretty great in fight scenes. I don't really have any problems with this costume, and the only reason it's only at number 11 is because the costumes in general, like I said, for Vandal Savage are pretty good, and Merlin's is pretty middle of the road, at least for this list. Not really middle of the road for costumes in general, because I think it is actually pretty good. The original Cicadas costume kind of grew in me over the course of the season. I think they definitely changed it over the season. Like, they made the actual trench coat part way more designed and a different fabric. I think like episodes 8 or whatever till whenever he was killed and whenever he was stopped as a main villain, his costume was pretty good. Once Cicada version 2 took over, they kind of just like carried that over from the first Cicada. It's definitely a pretty good costume in my opinion. I definitely think that it works for the concept of the character. At least it worked for the concept of the original Cicada. The second Cicada, I think they should have added more futuristic aspects to the character because she is from the future. That being said, I think it definitely is a costume that looks pretty good in scenes and also just in pictures. Again, the original Cicada's costume, like the first Cicada's first costume, really didn't like it. I thought it looked really bad, but they updated it for the show or for the episodes, and then the second Cicada took over and she had her own version of that costume, which I think is a pretty good costume.
You tasted death, and you wanted more. The truth is, everyone and everything must come to an end, even for one such as me.
I really like Ra's al Ghul's costume. It's basically what you would expect him to wear, like a live-action version of Ra's al Ghul. It's pretty comic book accurate, or at least I'm pretty sure it is. I didn't really do a comparison before starting this recording, but I'm pretty sure just based off looking at this version of Ra's al Ghul here, I think it probably is what the comic book version would look like if they were in live action. I think it looks pretty cool. I think it really fits the character as a whole, so he makes it into the top 10 as well as the top 9.
You don't say.
You will not interfere with my mission.
Interfering is our specialty.
I've only come to cleanse the sin of this world. Didn't feel like starting with yourself then? I'm not of this world.
Reign's design as a whole is definitely very different from the comic book version, like in the fact that she looks human, and her costume is way different, and I would say the costume is definitely at least a lot more functional, and I think it would work a lot better for a main villain. I do really like the design of it all. I think it really worked for the character. My only problem is the fact that it's black, and that's like really dark, especially like in the dark fight scenes that they had in Supergirl Season 3. Those fight scenes were kind of difficult to see. It works for certain other main villains that I will get to, like Zoom, because he has the blue lightning and the brightness of the Flash as a show to help him out to see the costume. For Reign as a character, I really like the costume. I think it definitely works, but it is definitely not my favorite main villain costume, and it is not even like in the top 5 because the actual color of it, I think it could have been just a little bit better.
What do you want?
For you to suffer the way I suffered. You and your team are gonna die in there. And I will be out there destroying your legacy. You'll die a villain.
Amico Queen's Red Arrow costume, although she was never called that, I think is actually pretty great. I really like the design of it all. It looks pretty similar to one of her comic book Red Arrow costumes, and I think it's pretty cool how they managed to make a more unique version of this costume, how it's dissimilar to Speedy's and Arsenal's. Don't get me wrong, this costume is nowhere near as good as Speedy's and Arsenal's, but I'm glad they gave her her own unique costume. I think it looks really cool. The color of it is, in my opinion, very good, and it manages to get one of the top slots on the list, despite the fact that I think this villain is not a good one. Again, that part of my opinion is disregarded completely from this list, which is why Red Arrow manages to get pretty high in the video.
Much more than this, I did it my
Lex Luthor appeared 3 times in Supergirl Season 4, and I'm pretty sure 2 out of 3 of those episodes he wore his Alexo suit, which is a suit that I think is pretty awesome. It's very comic book accurate. It really just feels like a slimmed down, less bulky version of the exo suit, that war suit, I'm pretty sure it's called, that Lex Luthor wears in the comics. It looks pretty great, especially when he's not wearing the helmet. I mean, the helmet makes it look cool when he's flying around and fighting. I feel like it would look pretty goofy if he didn't wear the helmet there, but when he's just standing here like in this picture right here, it looks really, really cool with him not wearing the helmet. It looks very comic book accurate. I really like the colors of it all, and I think it made for some pretty awesome scenes. That being said, this isn't really his main costume. For the most part, he doesn't wear it. For the most part, he wears just a suit, and for that suit, he would probably be like right above Damien Dark on this list, but I'm not counting that. I'm counting the Lexo suit because this is a costume, while a suit is not really, and while Damien Dark and Diaz don't have an alternative, Lex Luthor does in the Lexo suit.
Green Arrow?
No, I'm not Green Arrow.
Prometheus' costume, I think, is pretty awesome. I just really like the design of it all. I think that it makes for some pretty creepy scenes in the season, and it makes for some pretty awesome fight scenes as well. I would say it's a very unique costume because it doesn't look anything like the comic book version of Prometheus. This is a very different character, and it was said by the people behind the show that it is not really inspired, that the character or the costume isn't really inspired by the comic book Prometheus, because it's just really the name they're using. That being said, I actually like this costume a lot more than the comic book version of the costume, because I think it just looks way creepier, and I think it looks way better. I really like this costume, and although Prometheus in general is better without wearing his mask, I think he was still pretty awesome when he was wearing his mask, mostly, or at least partially, because of the costume. I didn't mean to say mostly. It's definitely not because of the costume, but at least is partially because of a pretty awesome looking costume. Deathstroke's costume is pretty amazing. It's very comic book accurate, or at least the mask is, which is the only part of the costume that you would really notice when they adapt it to live action. The rest of the costume, I think, really works for the entirety of the season, and works for the villain and the character. The costume makes him feel like he has this presence in the show. I think when he takes off the mask, the presence, although is still there, is definitely not as cool. Like the costume and the music and just the character in general, it worked so well for Arrow Season 2, and although Deathstroke is not my favorite main villain from Arrow because he is my second favorite, and Prometheus is my favorite, Deathstroke's actual costume is actually a lot better than Prometheus, making him number 4, while Prometheus is number 5.
He's not going anywhere, and neither are any of you. Thank you for bringing them to me.
You double-crossed us. He killed Ronnie. Guess my heart.
I've kind of flip-flopped between the last three, but I think number 3 would be Zoom. This costume, although I have one problem with it, which is that the torso area and the leg area are disconnected, which is a problem for some costumes in the Arrowverse as a whole. I don't think it's very distracting for the most part. I think that the liberties they took from the Zoom costume in the comics were definitely a great idea, because the Zoom costume looks way too similar to not only Reverse Flash as a whole, but Reverse Flash in the Arrowverse as well. This new black costume with the blue lightning as well works so well for the creepiness of the character, and the character as a whole was so much better when he was wearing his mask. I'm not going to say that the costume was the only reason he was a great character, but I think that it is actually a large part of why he was such a great and scary villain in The Flash Season 2.
Team Flash, back together again. With a new guy, Ralph Dibny. Welcome. You should be dead.
Yeah, I guess we have that in common.
We'll take care of that in a moment.
So I really had a hard time deciding between number 2 and 1, but in the end I decided that number 2 would be the Reverse Flash, who I think has a perfect costume. Now, they did kind of change one thing about the costume from the comics, which is that the leg area is black as opposed to yellow, but I think that the black going up to the yellow and how it like fades away turning yellow, or maybe kind of the other way around, it looks so cool. Honestly, this is the perfect Reverse Flash costume. There is only one problem, which is the zipper, similar with Zoom, similar again with a lot of Arrowverse costumes, but again, it's not distracting in the slightest, especially for this character, the Reverse Flash. It's the perfect antithesis to the Flash's costume, especially in this costume versus the Flash's Season 4 costume. I mean, look at those two costumes back to back. It looks so incredible, and it really enhances the rivalry between the two. I really considered this costume to be number 1 for a while, and again, I really flip-flop between this and the next character, but in the end I decided that this suit is just a little bit worse than the number 1 slot, but still it is a pretty perfect suit, and it is pretty amazing. Savitar's suit is maybe the least comic book accurate suit in the entire list, but I definitely think that is a good thing, because the comic book version of this suit looks pretty ridiculous, while this suit looks pretty amazing. This original design I think looks so good for the show, and it made for some great looking scenes. The CGI version of the suit with the glowing blue and how it looked in the entire show, in the actual show, looks so amazing, and while the physical suit, the one that they created like for episode 15 and onwards, doesn't look as good, and I do think that he looks kind of limited in his movement, it definitely is still an awesome suit nonetheless. While the CGI version looks a lot better, I think both versions of the suit are actually the best suits out of all the main villains in the Arrowverse. It was pretty close between Savitar and the Reverse Flash, but I think that Savitar is just a little bit better, and I think while Savitar is definitely not my favorite main villain on the Flash or on the entire Arrowverse at all, one thing they 100% nailed is his suit, and I think it looks amazing, and it is the best main villain suit in the Arrowverse so far. So anyway, let me know in the comments down below what you think about this video and what would your ranking be. If you want to see more rankings for all of the updated lists now that the seasons have ended, you could check out the playlist to all my recent rankings in the top right corner of the video. If you liked this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.